the utter gods, absolute entities responsible for the creation of numerous universes since ancient times, were known as the Supreme Beings. These beings continuously shaped and reshaped worlds in their pursuit of eternal life. Through this process, countless substances, souls, and laws came into existence. However, despite their vast power and knowledge, the Supreme Beings eventually found themselves gripped by an unrelenting sense of boredom. Seeking a means of amusement, they devised a cruel form of entertainment, observing their creations wage war against one another. To the Supreme Beings, the destruction brought about by these conflicts was a fascinating spectacle. Although it meant that countless beings would be forced to fight, perish, and be reborn in an endless cycle, such suffering was deemed necessary to alleviate their boredom. However, amid these unceasing battles, something unforeseen occurred. A Supreme Being, who had been observing the ongoing wars, was unexpectedly slain by one of his own creations. Meanwhile, in a completely different setting, a boy named Sun Suho excitedly announced to his friends that he had been accepted into an art university. His friends cheered for him, expressing both joy and a hint of jealousy at his achievement. However, their conversation was soon interrupted when a known bully approached Suho, offering his congratulations in a mocking tone. The bully sneered, remarking that he never would have imagined Suho possessed any talent for drawing. Recognizing the voice, Suho turned to face the speaker and, with a fearless expression, exclaimed that Sungchul was bothering him yet again. Annoyed, the bully corrected him, stating that he was not Kim Sungchul but Lee Yunchul. Suho merely responded with an indifferent "Oh, is that so?" dismissing the correction as unimportant. Lee Yunchul, growing irritated, accused Suho of ruining his plans to take over their high school. Suho, enraged, retorted that if not for him, Lee wouldn't have even managed to graduate safely. At that moment, across the classroom, a girl whispered to her friend that Lee Yunchul was at it again. She sighed, commenting on how childish his behavior was, especially since they were so close to graduation. Her friend nodded in agreement before adding that it was ridiculous for Yunchul to be harassing Suho, a boy who had already suffered the loss of his parents yet still managed to smile and move forward. Back in the confrontation, Lee Yunchul, unwilling to let the matter rest, attempted to punch Suho. However, Suho countered effortlessly, delivering a precise kick to Yunchul's face. He then advised the bully that they should simply live out their remaining school days in peace. Just as he finished speaking, though, something caught his attention. Yunchul, noticing Suho's reaction, mockingly asked what had startled him, boasting that the previous attack hadn't hurt at all. Without warning, he clenched his fist, a strange energy beginning to surge around him. Then, with newfound strength, he launched another punch at Suho. At the very last second, Suho managed to dodge, and in that moment, he realized that something about Lee Yunchul had changed. The entire class watched in stunned silence. The sheer force behind Yunchul's strike was unlike anything they had ever seen. Even the bully himself appeared shocked, as if he hadn't expected to be capable of such power. 2 years later, the main character, now a second-year university student, overheard a conversation in the hallway. A student was informing others that all lessons scheduled in the main building had been relocated to their next building. He also mentioned that hunters were currently engaged in subjugating monsters inside and warned everyone to stay away. A man dressed in black asked how long it had been since the hunters entered. A security officer responded that it had been slightly over 8 hours and, given that the gate was estimated to be D rank, the hunters should be finishing soon. The security officer emphasized that the situation could become dangerous for anyone who wasn't a hunter and urged everyone to keep their distance. The main character quietly reflected on the situation, thinking to himself that yet another gate had appeared. He recalled how, 3 years ago, mysterious portals known as gates had begun appearing worldwide, triggering a dramatic transformation in society. These gates served as passageways to dungeons. And once enough time had passed, the monsters within would emerge, attacking and killing people. However, humans had also changed in response. As if to counter this new threat, individuals with the ability to manipulate mana began to awaken. These individuals, known as the Awakened, possessed extraordinary powers. With the world changing so rapidly, many had believed that ensuing chaos would last indefinitely, but that was not the case. An awakened named Wu Jinchul had founded the Hunter Association, gathering awakened individuals and establishing the profession of hunters. Thanks to their efforts, order had been restored much faster than expected. Now, society was divided into two categories, the awakened and the non-awakened. The scene then shifted to the main character, who was in an art classroom, painting alongside other students. He contemplated the inequalities of the world. There were those who could only obtain rewards through relentless effort, struggling like ants, while others could simply reach out and take what they wanted. The ants eventually came to recognize their limits. No matter how hard the non-awakened worked, they could never bridge the gap between themselves and even an E-rank awakened. He understood that if hunters failed to close the gates, the world would face destruction. In other words, the non-awakened depended entirely on the awakened for survival, whereas the awakened could live without the non-awakened. This dependency made people deeply grateful to the hunters. It was because of them that ordinary individuals like himself could live peaceful lives. Yet, despite this gratitude, a sense of unease crept into his mind. He began to question whether he had grown too accustomed to never being able to achieve what he truly desired. The lingering absence of his parents, the helplessness of relying on others for survival, and the stark contrast to a time when it had felt like he could do anything. All of it weighed on him. What he once possessed had vanished, leaving behind only a hollow sense of powerlessness. Suho recalled how his mother had always told him that he resembled his father. He found himself wondering how his father would have escaped from a powerless situation like the one he was in now. Before he could dwell on the thought any longer, his teacher suddenly called his name, snapping him out of his reverie. The teacher commented that Suho seemed particularly focused today, curious. He asked what had been so enjoyable to draw. Suho responded that he had simply drawn based on his feelings. The teacher then examined the artwork and asked if it was meant to be an N, remarking that it was a highly creative depiction. Suho, taken aback, silently questioned why he had drawn such a thing in the first place. Meanwhile, outside the university, the hunters had finished clearing the dungeon and were emerging from the gate. Their relaxed demeanor reassured the crowd, and murmurs spread among the onlookers, confirming that the raid had been successfully completed. A security guard approached one of the hunters, offering his congratulations on a job well done. The hunter nodded and confirmed that the dungeon raid had been a success. However, he also mentioned that they had encountered an unusual monster, new type that had not been documented before. He described it as a humanoid creature capable of spewing blue flames from both its eyes and mouth. It had attacked them using its claws and fangs, but, strangely, it had not inflicted any serious injuries. He admitted that he had been scratched slightly during the fight, but he reassured the guard that it hadn't caused him any harm. Hearing this, the security guard remarked that it was surprising to see a monster like that, given that nothing similar had been spotted since the gates first appeared. He expressed relief that it hadn't been a particularly dangerous creature. Then, shifting back to protocol, he informed the hunter that he would need him to submit a report detailing the encounter. However, before the conversation could continue, the wound on the hunter's arm suddenly began to glow. A strange sensation spread through his body, and a flicker of confusion crossed his face. The security guard, noticing the change, called out the hunter's name in concern. But before he could finish speaking, the hunter, his eyes now glowing and eerie blue, lunged forward and sank his teeth into the guard. The crowd stood frozen in horror as Hunter Kim, overtaken by an unknown force, devoured the security guard alive. Gasps and screams filled the air as shock and terror spread through the bystanders. One of the hunters immediately recognized the blue flames engulfing Hunter Kim. They were identical to the flames emitted by the monster they had encountered in the dungeon. Before she could react, the mutated hunter lunged at her, devouring her on the spot. Panic erupted. The onlookers, realizing the horror unfolding before them, began fleeing in terror. Chaos spread like wildfire as people were attacked and consumed, only to transform into the same monster. As creatures themselves, screams filled the air, and within moments, the once peaceful surroundings turned into a battlefield of madness and bloodshed. Inside Suho's classroom, the students noticed the commotion outside. Curious and alarmed, many rushed toward the windows to see what was happening. Suho, still seated, turned to his classmates and asked what was going on. When he finally approached the window, his eyes widened in shock. Outside, people were viciously attacking one another, behaving like crazed lunatics. Fear quickly took hold of the students. Some whispered anxiously, wondering if this was a dungeon break. One student urged everyone to escape immediately before they got caught up in the chaos, while another insisted they should wait for the hunters to arrive. In desperation, one of the students turned to their instructor, reminding him that he was an awakened and pleading for him to do something. However, the instructor hesitated before admitting that he was only an E rank, far too weak to make a difference in a situation like this. Meanwhile, Suho's attention was drawn to the rooftop of a nearby building. He spotted a figure standing there. At first, it appeared human, but something about it seemed unnatural. Then, in an instant, the figure leaped across the gap between buildings. The students who noticed it gasped in horror and shouted for the others to run. Before they could react, the monster crashed through the classroom window, shattering the glass as it forced its way inside. Suho barely managed to duck in time. The monster stood ready to devour everyone in sight. Fear gripped the students as they screamed and scrambled to escape. However, the creature moved with terrifying speed, managing to sink its teeth into several fleeing students. Within moments, those bitten began to convulse, their bodies twisting and distorting as they transformed into monsters themselves. Amid the chaos, Suho's eyes landed on one of his classmates, who had fallen to the ground and was unable to move. Trembling, she reached out and pleaded for help, but fear paralyzed him. Instead of rushing to her aid, he turned and ran, convincing himself that he would find hunters to save her. Yet, as he bolted down the hallway, a harsh realization struck him. By the time the hunters arrived, she would already be dead. There was nothing he could do. Guilt flooded his mind. If only he were an awakened. If only he had power. Desperate, his thoughts drifted to his father. He asked himself, what would my father do if he were here? Meanwhile, back in the classroom, the monster had cornered the helpless girl. She pressed against the wall, her entire body shaking in terror. The creature crouched, ready to pounce. At the very moment it leaped toward her, Suho moved. He lunged forward, gripping a fire extinguisher, and swung it with all his strength. The metal canister smashed into the monster's face, knocking it back. Heart pounding, he steadied himself and muttered under his breath, if Dad were here, he wouldn't just stand by and do nothing. Just then, a glowing notification appeared before his eyes. You have met all the requirements to complete the secret quest, Courage of the Weak.